Ah yes, Street Fighter 2, one of the most influential video games in history. It is of course the title that not only rejuvenated the arcade market, but the 1991 game also served as a blueprint for the entire fighting game genre as a whole. Rather than simply move on to a Street Fighter 3 like many of us would have liked, we instead got multiple iterations and updates of the existing game, tuning and refining it further. It would not actually be until 1995 that fans would finally see a true new entry in the series, one of which would certainly not disappoint. The awesome Street Fighter Alpha would end up spawning a trilogy of games in its own right, all of which run off of Capcom's System 2 arcade hardware, with the trio of games also seeing ports to current generation home consoles, such as the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. The perfect next generation platforms for the next generation of Street Fighter. While this is the case, fans would be stunned in late 1996 when Street Fighter Alpha 2 was somehow ported to the by that point dated Super Nintendo. A conversion of the game which many people considered to be impossible previously. But as impressive a feat as this was, what if I told you that the SNES was not the only Nintendo home console to receive its own Street Fighter Alpha game back then? If you have seen my thumbnail and read this video's title, you know exactly where this is going. So without further ado, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the illegal version of Street Fighter Alpha 2 that is available on the humble NES. Yeah. The introduction of the Street Fighter Alpha sub-series was exactly the breath of fresh air that long-term fans of the franchise had been hoping for in the mid-90s. Chronologically set between the events of the World Warrior tournaments, which occur in the original 1987 game and Street Fighter 2, the Alpha games are midquels that cherry-pick fighters who appeared in the previous two games, so they could fight it out in this up until now previously unexplored time period of Street Fighter's universe. But it wasn't just Street Fighter characters who were here. Oh no. To make this order more exciting, characters from Final Fight would also be included, along with completely new fighters who were designed from the ground up specifically for this sub-series. Pair all of this with Street Fighter's new anime style art direction and a revamped combo system, the Alpha games, known as Street Fighter Zero games in Japan, now have an important video game legacy in their own right, so their modern celebration is much deserved. The second Alpha game, released in 1996, would include several improvements over the original, such as more characters, new attacks, different stages and endings, along with changes to the overall gameplay. As mentioned in the introduction, this video game would be famously ported over to the Super Nintendo, even though Capcom had largely shifted its focus to CD-based home platforms. The game would make impressive use of the SDD1 chip, allowing for on-the-fly graphic decompression on the humble hardware. However, this would result in some caveats, such as loading times when entering matches, while the sounds were loaded onto the sound chip. Still, this late release allowed those who had not yet upgraded to the next generation of consoles the opportunity to play an Alpha game on rudimentary 16-bit hardware. But what about the people out there who still only owned 8-bit systems? As discussed on this channel plenty of times in the past, while the Sony PlayStation was picking up steam in North America, Japan and Western Europe, in other parts of the globe 8-bit gaming was still flourishing. This was due to the cheap price points that Taiwanese and Chinese Famiclone hardware was offering consumers, meaning there was still profit to be made from making new unlicensed Famicom titles, which is why a Street Fighter Alpha game would end up on the basic NES, or on Famiclone systems more specifically. Who would be responsible for such a crazy feat? Well, Hummer Team of course. The Taiwanese lunatics who brought us the likes of Street Fighter 2 and Final Fight 3 for the system. Two titles we have looked at recently on this channel. Fortunately for the team responsible for this, by this point they already had experience working with fighting games. Due to their successful bootleg of Street Fighter 2, a game that just like the original they had tinkered with and released updates of over and over again, meaning that by the time the Alpha games existed, Hammer Team had already developed multiple unofficial Street Fighter games. Thus, they had a functioning fighting game engine they could change and manipulate with relative ease. So with a portion of the work already done, by 1997 Hammer Team would finally have an alpha game of their very own, which would be released as Street Fighter 02-97. So let's check out this Forbidden Game's awesome introductory sequence. Those with a keen eye who know the Street Fighter Alpha series well will be able to establish that the opening scene in the game is not a conversion of the one that can be seen in Street Fighter Alpha 2, but is instead the same one that can be seen in the original Alpha game. The whole game, including the stages and fighters who appear, all seem to be modelled around the first Alpha title. This indicates to us that, in all likelihood, Hammer Team were working on producing an 8-bit version of Alpha for some time, then would cheekily switch the name out to Street Fighter 02-97 because Capcom had already moved on to their next game before Hammer Team had finished working on their bootleg Alpha game. Naughty, naughty. The character select screen offers up a promising selection of 27 different fighters to choose from. But upon further inspection you will notice that Hammer Team have done the usual thing we have seen bootleggers do on here a lot, where they just take 9 of their fighters and then duplicate them all 3 times over. Amongst the characters we got Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, Sagat, Aiden, Sodom, Guy, Charlie Nash and Akuma, who goes by his Japanese name of Goki. This does mean though that fans of M. Bison, Birdie, Rose and Dan may be left a tad disappointed, as none of these fighters were converted for this scaled down version of the game. A lack of M. Bison is particularly perplexing, as not only did Hammer Team already make him for their previous games, but he is in the game's introductory scene too. Therefore his lack of inclusion seems completely nonsensical here. And let's be honest, no Dan makes me sad, as Dan Hibiki is without a doubt one of the greatest Street Fighters of all time. S tier in fact. So the fact that he has not been included feels more criminal than the existence of this illegal game itself. I guess players just have to put up with playing as the franchise's more stoic karate bums instead. For those who are familiar with Hammer Team's previous Street Fighter offerings, the gameplay, controls and feel of the game remains very similar, indicating that my suspicions are likely correct that this game utilises the same fighting game engine as their earlier titles. Still, much like the real Alpha games, new mechanics have been implemented to build on the action, such as it being possible to perform super moves. While this is the case, it is of note that the game doesn't contain actual super meters, but that doesn't mean that the moves themselves are not executable. If you can recall in my upload covering Street Fighter 2 for the Famicom, the easiest fighter to play with is Dao Sim, due to his ridiculous reach. In the arcade version of Street Fighter 2, balancing was applied to make the fighters more equal, but that doesn't seem to be the case with the Hammer Team version of the game, nor does it apply when talking about 02-97. As for the game's graphics, there is a definite improvement from the original Hammer Team Street Fighter game. The sprites are way more defined now, with some fluid movement, and the backgrounds themselves often have animated features. I particularly like the stage with a crowd watching on in the background, whom you can see energetically cheering as the fighting progresses. Music wise, the game is disappointing in places, as it seems that many of the tracks have just been reused from Hammer Team Street Fighter 2 bootlegs. In one amusing twist, for some reason they even decided to use the Street Fighter 2 menu screen music to accompany one of the stages, leading to hilarious sounding results. Just look at this. Like with many of these dubious unofficial conversions of classic games, the title has its fair share of shortcomings, including bugs, glitches and other issues. For example, when a round ends, the music doesn't stop, even though it is very clearly supposed to. Players who get distracted easily may also notice that at the top of the screen there is a row of garbled sprites. BootlegGames.fandom suggests that this issue was likely caused by someone assigning the wrong mapper to the game. Further to this, players may notice that Chun-Li's alpha stage doesn't seem to be in the game. However, this is not entirely true. Gamers using the emulator known as FCEUX can set the hex address in a way to make this missing stage reappear in the title, but if it was intended to be used in the retail version of the game, well, this is unclear. In terms of more obscure trivia regarding this game, it was sold on Famicom cartridges with at least 2 different label designs, and the version we have been discussing throughout this video was not the only version of the game that would end up being published. While Ka-Sheng would be the first publisher of this Hummer Team game, it would later be published by NT. This other version of the title removes the introduction showing M. Bison, and bizarrely, some of the characters have been removed too. I guess sometimes we will never fully be able to understand the genius behind some of these balmy international pirates. Anyway, that was Street Fighter Alpha for NES. If you enjoyed this one, be sure to click my annotation that leads to my upload on the Brazilian version of Street Fighter 2 that can be found on the Master System. Cheerio! Yeah!